Now, the top issues for people are cost of living and cost of living. There are obviously other important issues, but this is the one that will really cut through at the ballot box. So next week's federal budget will be important for the government. And of course, they're trying to convince us that the economy is on the mend. It's what Jim Chalmers and Albanese keep saying. What is it? Inflation has a 2 in front of it. But the latest OECD outlook has revised up global inflation forecasts while downgrading GDP growth projections for the next 2 years. Well, the Treasurer gave a bit of a budget preview today. He's talking about a gloomy year, but of course he blames that on Cyclone Alfred, Donald Trump's tariffs and global factors.
The global economy is volatile and it's unpredictable. There's a new US administration disrupting trade. There's a slowdown in China. There's war in Eastern Europe and a very fragile ceasefire in the Middle East.
For more, let's bring in former Treasury Assistant Secretary David Pearl. David, welcome. I mean, this business, they keep running the lines. We heard it last week when we were talking about power bills going up. Oh, well, you know, if there wasn't war in Ukraine, none of this would have happened. They can't keep shirking responsibility and saying, oh, well, it's Cyclone Alfred, it's this, it's that. You've had high government spending, which of course the RBA repeatedly warned was one of the reasons that interest rates weren't coming down last year. It's up to them.
Thank you for having me on, Caleb. You're right. Jim Chalmers repeatedly says that he is engaging in responsible economic management. Well, there's no responsibility and there's no economic management. The 2 surpluses he obtained were off the back of bracket creep, which makes Australian taxpayers poorer. He's run a deliberate high inflation strategy to boost the power of trade unions. So Australian disposable incomes have fallen by 9% since 2022 as a direct result of his actions, by far the worst economic performance in the OECD. And we face an uncertain world with global security concerns and a possible trade war, and we have no fiscal firepower available whatsoever, with deficits forecast throughout the forward estimates. So we're in a very weak position. Jim Chalmers has been an economic commentator, not a treasurer. He hasn't made hard decisions to cut spending, to take pressure off inflation and to make the RBA's job easier. He's stood by while Chris Bowen has imposed a huge tariff on the entire Australian economy in the form of the renewables crusade. And he's not lifted a finger while Tony Burke has taken our industrial relations system back to the Whitlam years.
Well, you mentioned bracket creep before. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the OECD Secretary-General Matthias Cormann, of course a former Liberal minister, said that the way to support economic resilience and drive sustainable growth that improves living standards was with prudent monetary and fiscal policies and reducing public debt ratios. But of course, Deloitte reports that the net debt is only going to grow over the next 4 years. So how does Labor expect to get away with it?
Well, it's interesting when we focus on debt, which is prudent, but it's also the size of government, as I've said before, Caleb. So if you look at the long-run fiscal forecasts for the government and the Parliamentary Budget Office, they do foresee a return to budget balance in 2034-35, but owing to bracket creep, lifting effective tax rates for Australians to historic highs, lifting the revenue share of the economy to historic highs. So even with that optimistic scenario, which assumes NDIS and defence isn't increased, and unrealistic assumptions that government spending won't grow, we're basically growing the size of government. Now, if we undo those unrealistic assumptions, Caleb, if we pay back bracket creep, if we accept that the NDIS, which is out of control still, grows far more than 8% per year, if we increase defence spending, which both parties I think are suggesting might happen, and if we apply more realistic assumptions to government spending in other areas, we will have a fiscal crisis. So the formal numbers that Deloitte's are looking at are fictitious, bad enough as they are.
Just quickly before we go the issue of bracket creep, and I was talking a little bit about this last night. There is a report in the Financial Review today that the average Aussie worker is on track to enter the 37% tax bracket by 2031 because marginal tax rates aren't adjusted for inflation. Now, of course, part of this would have been solved in stage 3 tax cuts as they were meant to happen because they would have abolished that tax bracket. But the reality is that you are paying more in income tax now than you were when this government was elected. By the end of the decade, you will be paying even more. This isn't sustainable long term. I mean, surely there comes a point where you can't sell this to people anymore.
Caleb, it's a dirty secret of Australian fiscal policy, and I must say both major parties have taken advantage of it. So they both offer income tax cuts to the Australian people, knowing full well that bracket creep will claw those back and eventually reverse them. So the Albanese government's revised stage 3 cuts will be reversed entirely by bracket creep within 6 years or in 6 years. But the opposition is making pledges to tighten our budget finances without indicating what they're going to do with bracket creep. And I do think that an opportunity for Peter Dutton in his budget reply speech would be to say to Australians, there will be no more bracket creep ever. You will not move into a higher tax bracket when your wages simply catch up with inflation, making you poorer. That would place so much more pressure on the swamp, on the deep state, on spending, whatever you want to call it. So I do think that it's up to the opposition to step up, not only on net zero, as I wrote today in The Australian, but also on bracket creep.
Yeah, well, it needs to happen, but first we need to sever that addiction that governments seem to have to our money in the form of tax. David Pearl, thank you so much for your time.